Well, goat cheese is one of those things that I feel is a little polarizing, especially in my days when I was working at a cheese counter. You know, I'd say blue cheese and goat cheese are the things that people would most often like bring up that they don't want. And I always kind of wondered why, because people would say like, no goat cheese. And to most people, that means one cheese, like a fresh-ish goat cheese, what the French called chèvre, and most people here label as chèvre. But you can make a range of cheese from goat's milk, just like you can with cow's milk, anything from fresh and rineless to something that's kind of soft, like a brie with a little bit of ripening, and then you know, any moving through like semi-firm cheeses all the way to hard aged cheeses can be made with goat's milk. And a lot of people don't realize that. And they had maybe a bad chèvre, you know, at some point, and it turned them off to goat cheese in general. And they sort of just decided no more goat cheese. And that's always the saddest thing to me, because there's so much going on in goat's milk. It has its own sort of unique set of flavors. And as it ages, it actually moves away from that goaty or tangy flavor we associate with fresh goat cheese, and moves more into really interesting sort of salty, savory, and even some sweet notes like butterscotch or maple. You can just get a great range of flavors, and a lot of people don't realize that, or sometimes they don't realize that a cheese they love is goat's milk, which is often the case. There's a cheese called Midnight Moon that's a goat Gouda, and it's very sweet, so people really like it. And a lot of times people are surprised. They're like, I thought I didn't like goat cheese, but I love this cheese. And again, it just has to do with, you can't really lump it all into a neat little ball and say all goat cheese is, but there are some interesting things about goat cheese. I'm going to show you guys a couple little technical slides that I use in my culinary school class. Not too technical, but let's see. Get this up. Here we go. So now this is a generalization because within each species of animal that we would traditionally associate with making cheese, there is, you know, there are also breed variances that within each species that also change. So this is a composite. This is not like the case with every single cheese that you're going to eat, because the breed we'll talk a little bit more about can also change that. But just to give you a general idea where it sits in comparison to, say, cow's milk or sheep's milk. And goat's milk is most similar in terms of its composition to cow's milk. Yet once you get into the nitty-gritty of species, the way our bodies digest it is quite different, because the molecules are structured quite differently. But in terms of the proportion of the most important components to cheese, which are fats, the solid protein, which is also known as casein, the liquid part of the protein is the whey, but of course that is drained off during cheese making, so it doesn't really factor into the cheese as much. And then there's the sugar, or what we call the lactose, and then this is sort of all those what we call solids that make up the cheese combined. So goat is pretty similar to cow. It has around the same amount of protein. It has slightly more fat and slightly less lactose. And their overall solids are really similar. Where you start to see really big differences is with sheep. Sheep has a substantial amount more fat and solid proteins than cow and goat, and the same is true for water buffalo. But we'll talk about those in other classes. So this is, again, just overall, but here's some more little details about goats that are pertinent to cheese. So the name, I'm just gonna click, the name is, it's a doe if it's a female, and it's a buck if it's a male. And so the lactation cycle for goats is not quite a full year. So that's why we often call goat's milk a seasonal cheese. Unless the herd is bred in a staggered pattern, the animals will naturally breed in the spring around now or a little bit earlier, and then they'll start producing milk for cheese, usually around late March. And that's why we often call goat milk cheeses spring cheeses. Same thing with sheep. Cows have a much longer cycle, so they almost make it the full year in their lactation cycle. Goats are very smart and very playful. They're the most like pets of any of the dairying animals. They recognize faces and people, and they attach themselves to certain people, much like a dog. And so some people really like working with goats and raising them because of this temperament. So yield is another big factor that wasn't taken into consideration of the proportions in the composition in the last slide, because obviously there's a huge difference between how much a cow would yield versus a goat. And goat and sheep obviously yield significantly less than cows. But as a proportion of their overall body weight, goats are the second most efficient in terms of producing milk. So a goat is milked twice a day, and they usually will yield about 6 to 8 pounds of milk per day, which is about 5 to 10% of their body weight. Again, this changes a lot depending on the particular breed of goat, but again, these are sort of just overall statements. And then specific dairy breeds that have been used for making cheese and producing milk for years actually produce way more milk. It's because they've been bred for those favorable qualities. So like Swiss goats or Saanen goats can produce over 20 pounds a day, which is over 10% of their body weight, which is why you will find this is a very common breed that is utilized in a lot of dairies all over the world. So grazing habits differ from species. Goats are not the best grazers. They really don't necessarily like to eat off the ground, and they're very choosy, contrary to the popular conception that they want to eat anything. They put everything in their mouth, but what they actually choose to eat, they prefer to eat off of bushes and trees rather than off the ground. And they select things that they enjoy the taste of, which plays a big role ultimately in flavors that manifest themselves in the cheese. So a special concern with goats that is not true of the other animals is that when you're breeding or when you have dairy goats, you have to keep the bucks away from the does. And often they don't even have bucks on the property, or maybe one, and they're kept really far away. Because if the women are near the men, their hormone levels naturally rise, and it can produce an off sort of barnyardy, not so favorable flavor in the milk itself. So the properties of the milk overall is that there's a higher percentage of short chain free fatty acids, which are an important part in yielding flavor. And the fat molecules in goat milk are small compared to specifically cows. So this means the resulting curds are smaller and softer. And this makes goat cheese significantly easier for a lot of people to digest. So that's often why when people say, I can really only eat goat cheese or sheep cheese, a lot of times it has to do with the composition of the milk itself. Because contrary to popular belief, there's actually not that much lactose in most cheeses. It's removed in the make process. So a lot of people, if they're having reactions to cheese, it's often not lactose. It might be maybe the fat molecules of cow's milk are hard for your body to digest versus a goat or sheep milk you could digest perfectly fine. And then this also tends to lend the cheese itself, this makeup, a smoother, creamier texture. So even with age, the cheeses don't get as dry and crumbly as, say, like a cow's milk cheese. And then last is the color. So goat cheese, as it ages, unlike cow's milk, it remains bone white. And the reason that is because goats break down beta carotene that they eat in the grasses and whatever they eat in their food. They break it down into vitamin A, which is colorless. So that's also why these cheeses have higher levels of vitamin A than cow's milk, but it's also why they have sort of a white chalky hue, whereas cow's milk turns golden yellow because the fat molecules capture that beta carotene. So last part is that goatee flavor we were talking about that people often object to. or what a lot of people might call a tangy flavor, is because of those free chain fatty acids that I mentioned in the last slide that goat's milk has more of. Well, these are what's largely responsible for a lot of the flavors and aromas we experience in cheese. So through the process of lipolysis, which is like breaking down of fat, what happens is these little enzymes clip the triglycerides, which you've heard of that as it refers to fat. It clips those three chains and releases them. And then they become free chain fatty acids. And these are then what create a lot of flavors and aromas. So there are 4 particular ones listed here. It's super technical, so if you're into it, they're there, but these are a lot of those flavors. These are what manifest those flavors that we think of as goatee and that you don't find in cow and sheep's milk cheese, because these unique free chain fatty acids don't exist in those cheeses, whereas they're very prevalent in goats. All right. So just a little technical, but then what does that mean in terms of experiencing goat's milk? Well, as a cheese ages, the flavor of it changes and evolves significantly, as well as the texture. And then also in terms of the way that cheese itself is made. So starting with what we started the whole discussion with, what most people think of as goat cheese, which is fresh goat cheese or fresh chev. So this is really just minimal manipulation of goat's milk. Sometimes a little rennet is added or something to acidify it, and then it's drained of its whey, and then that's chev. It's very basic, and it's where you're really going to taste the influence of the milk the most, because it's just one step removed from milk. So not all chevs are created equal. And the reason I think a lot of people have a bad first experience is access. You know, in a lot of areas, a lot of the goat cheeses you might find in a grocery store are more mass produced. They might be pre-crumbled, which means additives have been added. And all of this, the way a cheese, the way the milk is handled and the animals are treated affects the flavor of the cheese. And the more care that's taken in those acts, the less of those off flavors that develop. So I don't like to normally say that like expensive means better, but in this case, more expensive, it still shouldn't be too expensive of a cheese. More expensive usually signifies that maybe it's a small family farm, which is definitely something local. You know, these are fresh cheeses, local's always going to be best, because then you know there's not necessarily preservatives added. And a lot of these actually, if you get a good quality chev, it shouldn't be too overtly tangy or too in a negative way. It will always have a tang because that's goat, but I mean, I've had some chevs that I think if I blind tasted them to some people, they wouldn't even realize it's from goat. It can be quite delicate and delicious, like a breakfast cheese or something you might use in place of cream cheese on a bagel. And there's a couple local ones I really like. A lot of them are farmstead, which means they raise their own animals. So that's that much more level of control. What the animals eat is super important to the flavor of the cheese. So knowing that they let them free roam and eat, and they're not just being fed industrial feed, will affect the flavor, particularly the aromatics of the cheese. So aromatics come more into play when we move away from fresh, but in the fresh category, I really love Bladesville Creamery, which is located just outside of Milwaukee. There's Cabriolet. They're great. They're one of the original people producing farmstead goat cheese here in the United States, and they're in Indiana. We have more widely available is Vermont Creamery. You can find those in Whole Foods everywhere, and they're a great farm, sort of a cooperative small network of farms in Vermont that was started by Allison Hooper, who's another pioneering person in the cheese world. And all of those are things here in Chicago. You can definitely find Cabriolet and Bladesville. So, and Vermont Creamery, like I said, you can find all over the country. So one step removed from fresh, we have what we call soft ripened. And this is any cheese that has a little bit of a rind that is a result of that is ripening the cheese. So in this case, this is a mixture of mold and yeast, but also bacteria. If you think of cheeses we think of as stinky, that's a bacteria that is actually ripening it. But what this means is it started as fresh, and then with time and the right cultures and the flora in the air and the atmosphere, the spores, if it's mold, has started to develop on the cheese and then also change the cheese itself. So you move one step away from those super lactic fresh flavors, and then you start to get a little bit more complexity and a slight softening of maybe that tang. But now you'll start to get flavors from the influence of whatever is doing the ripening. So in the case of, say, a brie, you would get like a goat brie would have mushroomy flavors from that mold rind or earthy flavors. If it's a yeast ripened cheese, which is very famous in the Loire Valley, is the most famous little goat cheeses in the world. They have these little wrinkly brain rinds. So that's actually a mixture of yeast, and then the molds do sort of populate on there, but the base of it is yeast. And so those have more of a bready aroma, yeasty aroma. And then when we get into bacteria, that's where we start to get that like kind of funky, footy, sweaty sort of bodily, beefy smells. And so all of these are going to sort of intermingle with the goat flavors. And I find a lot of people prefer, say, a goat brie or camembert to a cow because it's actually milder than a cow's milk camembert. Cow can get those really like kind of Brussels sprouty sort of like cabbagey, funky flavors. And the goat's milk is actually softened with the development of that rind. So I find this is another area it's great for people to experiment with who are a little bit timid about goat cheese, because you might find something that really suits you. And then as we move on from there, we start to get into a much broader category of aged cheeses. And this is where I think goat's milk are just incredibly dynamic and also incredibly palatable. I think this is the category where most people would enjoy these cheeses if they can get rid of the preconceived notion of what goat is or can be, you know, because in these cheeses, you'll find a ton of, like I said, you get those sweet notes that intermix with a nice salty flavor. This is where I think the diet really comes into play with cheeses that are coming from people who take their animals and the way they raise it seriously. You get nice herbaceous notes. There's just a ton of complexity that you get with goat's milk. And the added bonus that because of the structure of the fat, you get this softening of the paste as the cheese ages. Sometimes I love the taste of a cow's milk cheese that's aged, but I find the texture is maybe a little too dry for my taste, or not what I want. It can be a little sandpapery or sort of gritty. With the goat's milk, there's almost a softening where it sort of, as it ages, the fat breaks down more and it continues to get creamy. It's solid, but when it really melts in your mouth, and I find that a really great quality. And you'll find this with, say, an aged goat Gouda, whether it be from Holland. One of my favorites from Holland is called Brabander. But there's tons of them, that Dutch Goudas, or the Midnight Moon is made in, well, it's made overseas, but it's made for Cypress Grove in California. And then there's also Central Coast Creamery makes a goat Gouda out of California as well. And those are all really good examples. But then there's additionally some great goat's milk cheeses being made in Spain. Spain is pretty much the only country in Europe where, actually, in terms of our dairy and culture as well, where there's way more goat and sheep milk production than there is cow. Cows yield the most and they sort of rule the industry everywhere else. But because of the geography of Spain, it's very rugged in a lot of places, and goat and sheep are more durable than cows. They're not going to find themselves up on craggy cliffs or in really dry, hot plains. That would not work for cows. So a lot of the native cheeses have you know, are based on indigenous breeds that date back, you know, thousands of years to Iberia and, you know, sort of cultures pre-existing Spain. And there's so many great goat and sheep milk cheeses from Spain, and you're gonna get a much better value. The domestic ones are great, but unfortunately they are more expensive because you need more animals, you need more land. It's a more expensive proposition. But in Spain, we have these classic cheeses like Garrocha, which is made in Catalonia. And this is a great aged goat cheese. I highly recommend that as a good one for people to start with. And in addition to the Goudas. But then there's also here in the States, people and overseas sort of making styles that are traditionally cow's milk, but utilizing goat's milk. So one example of that is one of my favorite aged goat cheese is from Mary Quick, who is a traditional cheddar maker in England. And she makes a traditional 50-pound wheel of cheddar, but with goat's milk. Because the British take cheddar super seriously, you can't technically make cheddar from goat. They don't label it cheddar, but they call it the hard goat, but it's made in a cheddar recipe. And again, it's really complex and delicious. There's a producer in Wisconsin called LeClaire, and they make a great aged goat cheese called Evelon. I'd say it's a little bit of a mix between a Gouda and maybe an Italian style cheese. That's another one that is quite nice. There's also French cheese. There's a lot of aged goat cheeses from France. I find in Chicago in particular, those can be a little bit harder to find. But there are tons of, usually they're going to say tome de chèvre, tomate de chèvre, and tome just means a small wheel. So that could range anything from semi-soft to quite hard. It sort of depends on the specific producer and the specific make. But if you see those words, it's probably, you know, in that category. And then there's also some great Belgian goat cheeses that I'm also quite a big fan of. And I don't know why, or I'm not sure if I know any shops that carry it. Perhaps all together now. I think they might have the one. There's a cheese called Cabriolet. That's one of my favorite, and it's modeled after a traditional Abbey style tome, like that the monks used to make, but made with goat's milk. So that one has a nice, almost the texture of, say, like an Alpine cheese, like a Gruyere, but in goat's milk, so slightly more creamy. And those are all, you know, there's a ton of different recipes once you get within aged, and that will affect the overall flavor of whether it might be a little more savory or a little more sweet. The Goudas will be more sweet leaning. So if that's your preference, I would definitely go Gouda. But if you are interested in some of the more herbaceous notes I mentioned, I think Garrocha is definitely the way for you to go. And if you're looking to try something domestic, like I mentioned, the Evelon from Wisconsin, I know you can find that in lots of stores here in Chicago. I'm pretty sure Whole Foods has it too. So that's another one that I would seek out, and not quite as sweet as the Goudas, but it definitely leans, kind of tilts in that direction. You get some nice sort of caramelly notes in there, as well as some nice grasses. So yeah, I think that's sort of the rundown. Does anyone have any specific goat questions?
Yes, Deb.
Okay, so you mentioned that it's a seasonal cheese, which I didn't realize. So does it taste differently depending on when the milk is harvested? Is that the right? I don't know.
No, that's actually a really great question, because this is a little short, so I didn't go into too much depth. But actually, where an animal is in their lactation cycle is one of the largest factors that the milk composition changes. And if you think about it, it makes sense. And for people that are mothers, they might know that the milk changes, because our bodies are really smart. So as soon as an animal gives birth, there's the colostrum, which is that initial super protein rich, fatty, like just supposed to be like the first, like, welcome to the world, you're gonna need this. And they get that. Any responsible farm would always allow the babies to have that. And then as the mother moves away from the birth, the composition changes. The solids, like the proteins and the fats, sort of, I mean, it depends on the breed, but they tend to level off, and then they'll eventually dip down. And then at the end, before they dry off, there's a slight uptick. And so that's something a cheesemaker, that's really the kind of art and science of cheesemaking, because consumers want consistency, but you really have a, even though you're always doing the same thing day in and day out, the composition of the thing you're creating is different, which means maybe you need a little less rennet, maybe you need to cook it a little more. So it's always an intuitive process. And that lactation cycle is a big part of that. And then, you know, like I said, there's additionally other things that affect the composition. But that is by far one of, because that's probably one of the largest factors. And then this, in terms of it being seasonal, that is a term, I think it's a little confusing in the cheese world, because I think in our modern age, we think of seasonal as like kind of more the marketing sense of like only available now, like get it up, buy it up sort of. And that is sort of the case with goat and sheep's milk, but it's more so that it has this cycle and the animals dry off. And then there's a period for a lot of small farms where like, from December or January, depending on their inventory, till about March, where the animals are not producing milk. So it means that there's a season where the cheeses become available again. But then most of those cheeses will be available throughout the rest of the year, So it's the way we use seasonal, and it's a little different than, but that being said, there are still cheeses within that subsect that are seasonal in the marketing sense too. Like some producers find that certain milk composition lends itself to a specific style, so they might only make that at one point. But in terms of the fresh cheeses, they work with the evolving cheese composition to try to make the same cheese throughout the year. So a lot of those cheeses, like Chev and any of their little soft ripened ones, would be available throughout most of the year.
Has there ever been a creamery that's just like gone with that though, and been like, we're just going to make it per what the lactation cycle is? Or is that like still a revolutionary thought perhaps?
No, I mean, some of the farms I mentioned dry off, like Prairie Fruits Farms in Champaign-Urbana, and Idle Farms is in Michigan, and Blakesville has their farmstead, so they have their own animals, but they have quite a large herd. They have about 400 animals, so they're not all milking at the same time. So they have a stagger, so they do have a consistent milk source. And this is largely because before they built the creamery on the property, they supplied fluid goat's milk for sale. And so obviously there's a demand for that year round. So they already had that pattern sort of built in. And again, it doesn't degrade the quality of the milk. It's just a matter of how you manage your herd and whether you sort of just adhere to that natural pattern, or, like in Spain, when you go to the sheep milk producers who make manchego, they make manchego every day of the year. Even though sheep have a lactation cycle that doesn't permit this, again, they have to make the amount of manchego that a lot of these producers make. They could be buying milk from a cooperative, or they might have their own farm, but a small artisanal producer I have visited of manchego had, I think, because sheep produce less than goats, they had 600 animals. So again, they are able to stagger, and that's small because the yield on sheep it's pretty abysmal. They've bred for genetics there, so the sheep in Spain yield way more than anywhere else. Specifically here, because of like another thing sort of setting us back here in terms of why our sheep's milk is so expensive and so many people don't use it here, is that you're not allowed to buy animals from Europe and bring them here because of like mad cow disease and all that. There's like a lot of livestock rules. So you cannot do that. So they have these genetics where they've been breeding these sheep for thousands of years, and they just produce way more milk now, you know, but we can't get that. We have to like start kind of, you know, I won't say from scratch, but from the middle.
Well, we'd have to like clone, and there's a whole different thing with that.
Yeah.
So, you know, there was Dolly, but I mean, how many dollars?
I don't remember the names.
Yeah, right.
Thank you. Well, because I went to, I was on cheese tour several years ago in Wisconsin, and one producer, this was cow's milk, they reserved a certain time that they used the milk themselves to produce cheese, and then they sold the milk for the rest of the year. They sold it to other, other cheesemongers to make their cheese. And they said, no, we reserve it, we use it this, and we happened to hit one of those other places. They're like, oh yeah, we buy their milk this time of year. I thought, there's
a lot of that. There's a cheesemaker in Wisconsin called Willie Lehner, and he only uses milk from other people's farms and makes cheese in other people's facility. He has a cave on his property, but he doesn't have the equipment anywhere. And there's a farm, they now use the milk to make another seasonal cheese, but there's Uplands, which makes Pleasant Ridge Reserve, and they only make their flagship cheese, Pleasant Ridge Reserve, when the cows are on grass, because it's modeled after an alpine cheese, and that's a huge part of the flavor profile. So they used to have all this time once the cows went into the barns that they didn't use the milk, but then they started doing another cheese from the Alps that they make with that, you know, that first sort of late, like early winter milk, and it's a little soft stinky cheese called Rush Creek, but they still have milk during that period that maybe they still sell off. But before they made that cheese, like Willie bought almost all of their milk and would make cheese from it. There's a lot of that in Wisconsin. Well, there's a huge dairying culture in Wisconsin, so there's a lot of resources, and you know, people who are making similar styles of cheese talk and help each other out, and it's a whole like.
You said that this Willie guy, does he has the cheese cave at his house?
On his property,
like in his backyard?
Yeah, it's like in a hillside. He blew out the side of a hill. That's probably where you went.
I'm wondering.
There's only one person with a cave in their backyard.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably Willie.
Oh, wow.
Okay. But he doesn't make it on the property. He has no animals. It's just the cave.
Right. Yeah. Oh, wow. Small world.
Yeah.
So then, okay, so if I were going to do a cheese tasting, what would you recommend? Like if I wanted to introduce this to people, what would you recommend in terms of like, would you recommend like a goat's milk versus, and have people compare it to a cow's milk, the same style of cheese?
I mean, you could. The thing is that, I mean, I think it's almost more interesting to do a vertical of goat cheeses.
Okay.
And then, you mean, if you're into tasting cheese, you could, of course, then, you know, do another plate where you have a mix of stuff. But I think to really kind of see like what happens to goat cheese under the influence of age, it's easier to compare it to itself rather than like because there'll be some similarities to the cow's milk, but you'll ultimately find that like a cheddar made with goat's milk versus a cheddar made with cow's milk, besides the acidity and that sort of profile we associate with cheddar, it's totally different. Like you might not even be like, this is a cheddar, you know, so I don't know, like that would be another fun comparison to do though, like to do a goat Gouda, a cow Gouda of like the same age, you know, alpine or whatever. But I think I love doing all goat milk boards, or I've done boards for a lot of restaurants and things like that. And when people will do it, there's also like the best names for goat flights. My favorite was 50 Shades of Goat. I did. But yeah, because there's just such a range of flavors, especially as you start with the fresh and move. And then, you know, we didn't even really talk about goat milk blues, but those are a thing too. And they're actually milder than cow's milk blues in a lot of cases. They're a little more lemony. There's a good one. They can be a little tricky to find. but there's a good one from Wisconsin, from Carr Valley, called Billy Blue. There's a Spanish one. It's actually a mix of goat and cow. It's called Valdion, but that's another good one, but that's not strictly goat. And then there are some Italian ones, like there's Capra Verde, which is essentially a gorgonzola, but made with goat's milk, and that's quite excellent. Probably, I doubt you could find it here. I could be wrong, but I haven't seen it anywhere here in a while, but you can definitely find the Carr Valley, the Billy Blue. If you like blue, it's a fun one to try.
Right,
I
thanks.
have a few questions.
Yeah.
The easiest one. Can you find goat Gouda in Trader Joe, or they don't sell it?
It might be a little advanced for Trader Joe's.
I don't remember I ever saw something like that. So where can I find it?
Whole Foods definitely has it. I think they have the Midnight Moon for sure, but they might also have some other ones. L&M, which is it's in Lincoln Square. I don't know what area you live in. It's a little gourmet shop, and they often have Brabander, which is the Dutch aged Gouda that is my favorite. That I've seen it there. They also have that at All Together now. And it's beautiful rind.
I'll try Whole Foods.
Yeah, but you'll definitely find a goat Gouda at Whole Foods. Midnight Moon, definitely. And then, like I said, they might have some others as well.
So you mentioned the outer part of the cheese, the bacteria, so it's becoming a bit harder.
In soft ripened cheeses. So these are like, this one's it's a little more aged than maybe ideal, but it's more of a demo.
So in many cheeses,
but it would be like a brie or something that has that soft edible rind on the outside.
right. So in many cheeses, I'm not sure if I should eat that part or not. Sometimes it's with something that wraps it, that's for sure to take it out. But
so in soft cheeses like brie or like these little goat cheeses, the rind is intended to be eaten. It's a large part of the flavor. That being said, some people don't like them. I've been to lots of parties where people carve out the center of a brie. I also say that's a kind of an indicator of quality. The more mass-produced a cheese is, usually the thicker that and less palatable that rind is, because to get a nice even thin rind, you have to literally like kind of care for the cheese and handle it multiple times a day. So it just depends on the scale you're operating at. But the rind, if it's a well-made cheese, on those soft ones, you should definitely eat, because that's a big part of the effort of the cheese itself. But as you age, like you mentioned, obviously something coated in wax is not intended to be eaten, or some of these cheeses have these edible polycoats. You don't eat those. But like say with these cheeses, like this is the Garocha. This is what I call a natural rind.
so you eat this?
So this is mold and sort of atmosphere. You can eat it.
Oh,
it is.
Okay.
It's natural. It's the cheese that's just been the same as the interior cheese, but it's been affected by the atmosphere. Whether you like the taste of it or not, I find most find it a little too earthy or intense. And if you are going to eat it, I would recommend having it be mostly the paste and only a little bit of the rind, because the rind is way more intense. I always tell people to try it if they're curious, and then if you like it, eat it. If you don't like it, don't. It kind of depends on the style. Like with washed rinds, a lot of times people do like these. They're a little gritty, but they have some interesting notes in them. Kind of like peanut shell sort of like quality. But yeah, it really depends. Natural rinds are technically edible, but whether you'll like them, it kind of depends. I find for the most part, people don't like aged rinds, but I'm also in food, but I've certainly encountered those people who are just like, wow, this is good. I don't care.
I'll try.
But it will be much more intense, and it has those earthy, it tastes like the wherever it aged. So it has those like cavey, earthy flavors, which some people really like and some people do not like it. It's like, were you a kid that ate dirt or did you not eat dirt? I think it's maybe how that happens. I
Now,
haven't done any real research on that topic, though.
I'll try, I'll let you know.
Yeah.
Now, making the cheese, is the process is same as cow cheese, or
Mhm.
so all the different animals?
Cheese
process
making
the same?
is universal in terms of the steps. Obviously, there are a lot of steps that are optional, that like if you're making a younger cheese, like you're not going to be pressing it and cooking it the way if you're making a hard or aged cheese. So there's variations from style to style in the make itself, but from milk to milk, the overall recipes are the same. It's just how you adapt to the composition of that milk will be a little bit different. So, you know, like sheep's milk will coagulate faster because it's more solids. So it's just a matter of, again, that intuition of, you know, most people don't make a lot of people kind of like, unless they have a farm with a lot of different animals, they're usually only making cow's milk or only making, you know, sheep or goat's milk. But so you have to tweak because of those compositional differences, but the overall recipe is the same. But the time you might cook it or the time you might need for it to coagulate, that will vary from species to species. But the steps will be the same. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. So talking about goats, there is a tourist attraction. It's just between Georgia and North Carolina. Small farm called Goats on the Roof. It's so cool.
Well,
And
Like Door County.
yeah, in
Yeah.
Door County, there's a Swedish restaurant that has goats on the roof as well.
Yeah.
yeah, they're just walking in between the buildings on bridges.
They like it because it's like, again, they were a lot of times used in areas that were rocky, mountainous, like they like to climb. Same thing with sheep. But I've never seen sheep on a roof. Again, there's not as many sheep here.
I kind of want to see a sheep on the roof now. Like the goats, oh, I've seen that. That's nothing new, but a sheep, that sounds fun.
Goats are a little more entertaining than sheep.
Yeah,
In
that's
all
true.
honesty.
Sheep just kind of like hang out, and goats are like yeah, you're right. The temperament, they want to play. So.
Sheep are a little skittish.
Oh,
Herd mentality.
Okay, I digress.
Yeah.
So any other questions on goat cheese or goats? No? Well, I think that is it for today.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Lydia. This was,
of course, my pleasure.
As always, we always love to learn more about cheese because then it makes us want to go and taste more cheese. And that is always the best way to learn things, is to taste more and try more things. So thank you so much. We will have another taste talk on Monday. Sruthi Swaminathan will be back and we'll be making a pasta dish with farfalle and a coconut tahini. So that's going to be flavorful for certain, as almost every single dish she makes is. And then we'll have Lydia coming back in a little bit too. So I can't remember exactly when, but
it's the week after. Yeah.
I think we're going to be talking about sheep's cheese next. So we move on from the goat to the sheep. Thank you, everyone, and I hope everybody has a fantastic weekend. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.